The rapids roared like thunder half a mile downstream, and Jacob Kellerman stood at the riverbank with his hand on the birchbark canoe he had spent 6 months perfecting. Every trapper who had come through this valley said the same thing. The Snake's Throat could not be run, not by boat, not by raft, not by any craft made by human hands. But Jacob had watched his partner drown trying to portage around these very rapids the previous spring, a 3-week detour that had cost them everything. What he had learned in the months since would either prove everyone wrong or make him the next man to disappear into the churning white water that had claimed 17 lives in the past decade. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if tales of frontier innovation and survival move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode reveals an even more unbelievable discovery from the American wilderness. The Snake River cut through the Oregon Territory like a wound in the earth, and nowhere was that cut deeper or more vicious than the 3-mile stretch trappers called Snake's Throat. Jacob Kellerman had first heard about it during his second winter in the mountains, sitting around a fire at the rendezvous of 1839. An old voyageur with scars crossing his weathered face had described the rapids with a mixture of reverence and terror, explaining how the river narrowed from 200 yards to barely 30 as it dropped through a basalt gorge. The water didn't just flow through Snake's Throat. It attacked, compressed by stone walls into a hydraulic force that could splinter logs and roll boulders the size of wagons along the riverbed. Standing waves rose 10 feet high. Whirlpools formed that could suck a craft underwater. Hidden rocks lurked just beneath the surface, waiting to tear hulls apart. When Jacob asked if anyone had ever successfully run the rapids, the voyageur shook his head and spat into the fire. 17 men had died trying over the past decade, their bodies never recovered. By the spring of 1842, Jacob had spent 7 seasons trapping beaver along the tributaries that fed into the Snake. He was 32 years old, competent with rifle and trap, and careful in ways that kept him alive when recklessness killed so many others. He had partnered that season with Daniel Mercier, a French-Canadian voyageur whose family had paddled birchbark canoes for 3 generations. Their trapline that spring had been extraordinarily successful, nearly 200 prime beaver pelts by early May. But there was a problem. The nearest trading post was Fort Boise, roughly 80 miles downstream. Between their camp and the fort lay Snake's Throat. The standard route avoided the rapids through a portage that added 80 miles and required 3 weeks to complete. The trail climbed through dense forest, skirted cliff faces, and crossed boulder fields that destroyed boots and tested endurance. Men had died on the portage, twisted ankles became infected. Falls broke bones. The previous year, 2 trappers froze to death in an early snowstorm. But the portage was still safer than the rapids. Jacob and Daniel discussed their options on a mild evening in mid-May, the distant thunder of Snake's Throat audible even from 2 miles away. Daniel wanted to attempt the portage immediately, arguing that every day they delayed gave competing trappers time to reach Fort Boise first and flood the market. Jacob wanted to scout alternatives, convinced there had to be a better way. They argued until Daniel proposed a compromise. They would start the portage but move carefully, making sure every step was secure. Jacob agreed reluctantly, unable to shake the feeling they were making a mistake. 3 days later, that feeling would prove prophetic. The portage began on a Thursday morning with clear skies and temperatures already climbing toward uncomfortable by mid-morning. Jacob and Daniel divided their gear into manageable loads, each man carrying roughly 60 pounds of pelts, traps, and supplies strapped to pack frames they had constructed from willow branches and leather cord. Their bullboat, a lightweight craft made from buffalo hide stretched over a willow frame, weighed only 35 pounds when dry. Daniel insisted on carrying it himself, arguing that his experience with boats made him better suited to protect it from damage during the difficult climb. Jacob didn't argue. He took the heavier pack instead, containing their iron traps and tools that couldn't be replaced easily in the wilderness. The first 2 days went smoothly, despite the brutal terrain. The trail was well established from years of use, marked periodically with cairns built by previous travelers. They climbed steadily away from the river, the sound of Snake's Throat gradually fading behind them as they gained elevation. The forest was dense with pine and fir, the ground carpeted with needles that made footing treacherous on steep sections. They made camp the first night beside a small spring, exhausted but satisfied with their progress. The second day brought them to the cliff section that every trapper who had completed the portage mentioned with a mixture of pride and residual fear. The trail here was barely 2 feet wide in places, carved into the side of a basalt cliff face that dropped nearly 300 feet to a boulder-strewn slope below. They moved one at a time, each man waiting until his partner had crossed a particularly dangerous section before following. Day 3 started badly. Jacob woke with his left knee swollen and aching from a twist he had suffered the previous afternoon. He said nothing to Daniel, knowing his partner would insist they rest, and rest meant losing another day to competing trappers. They broke camp in silence and continued along the cliff trail, moving slower than Jacob would have liked but maintaining steady progress. By noon they had covered nearly 2 miles and were approaching the highest point of the portage, where the trail would begin its descent back toward the river below the rapids. Daniel was ahead by perhaps 50 feet, the bullboat balanced carefully on his shoulders, when Jacob heard the sound that would replay in his nightmares for years afterward. A sharp crack, like a rifle shot but shorter, followed immediately by Daniel's startled shout. Jacob looked up in time to see a section of the cliff edge where Daniel had been standing simply cease to exist. Rock that had been solid for thousands of years suddenly wasn't. Daniel fell backward, the bullboat tumbling separately, both man and craft disappearing over the edge. Jacob dropped his pack and ran forward, his injured knee forgotten in the surge of adrenaline. He reached the edge and looked down, his stomach lurching at what he saw. Daniel lay 40 feet below on a boulder shelf, his body twisted in ways that bodies shouldn't twist. The bullboat had landed separately, torn completely in half by impact with the rocks. Jacob scrambled down the cliff face, cutting his hands on sharp stone, moving faster than was safe or sane. Jacob reached Daniel's side in minutes that felt like hours, his hands bleeding from the desperate descent. Daniel was still breathing, but each breath came shallow and wet, a sound Jacob recognized from men he had seen die before. Blood pooled beneath his partner's body, seeping from injuries Jacob couldn't see and knew he couldn't fix even if he could. Daniel's eyes found Jacob's face, and for a moment there was clarity there, an understanding that passed between them without words. Daniel tried to speak, coughed blood, tried again. His voice came as barely more than a whisper. He spoke of his grandfather in Quebec, a master canoe builder who had worked with birchbark his entire life. He spoke of rivers back east where the water ran clear and cold, where canoes glided like dreams across, surfaces smooth as glass. He spoke of techniques passed down through generations, of knowing which trees to harvest and when, of understanding how bark and wood and pitch could become something greater than the sum of their parts. Then his breathing stopped, and Jacob sat alone on a rock shelf with his dead partner and the ruins of their boat. He buried Daniel 2 days later beside the trail, marking the grave with stones he carried up from the slope below. He sat beside the grave for another full day, watching the river far below, listening to the distant thunder of Snake's throat, thinking about the waste of it all. Good men died on this portage every year. Good men died in the rapids. Good men died because there was no safe way through this section of country, and everyone simply accepted that as the cost of working this territory. Jacob couldn't accept it. Daniel's last words had planted something in his mind, a seed that grew as he sat there in the wind. Birchbark canoes. Daniel's grandfather. Rivers that could be run instead of walked around. Jacob abandoned the pelts at a cache he built near Daniel's grave. He took only essential supplies and began the walk back to his cabin on the Clearwater River, a journey that took him 8 days through country he barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, turning over everything he knew about boats and rivers and the engineering problems that separated life from death in the mountains. He arrived at his cabin in early June to find it undisturbed, his winter supplies still secure, everything exactly as he had left it 2 months earlier. He spent the next 3 weeks traveling through the territory, talking to every trapper, trader, and tribal member he could find. He asked about canoes, about construction techniques, about materials and methods. Most thought he had lost his mind from grief. Some shared what little they knew. In late June, Jacob met an elderly Nez Perce man named Twisted Root at a trading post on the Salmon River. Twisted Root remembered the voyageurs from his youth, remembered their birchbark canoes, remembered watching them paddle upstream with loads that should have been impossible. When Jacob explained what he wanted to do, Twisted Root studied him for a long moment before speaking. Twisted Root spoke bluntly about why Jacob's plan would fail. Birchbark canoes were built for the calm waters of the Great Lakes and the gentle rivers of the Northeast, not for the violent mountain torrents of the West. The bark was too thin, the ribs too widely spaced, the pitch too brittle in cold water. A traditional canoe might survive a season of careful use in friendly conditions, but Snake's Throat would destroy it in minutes. Jacob listened carefully, asked questions, and took notes in a leather journal he had started carrying. He wasn't discouraged by Twisted Root's warnings. He was learning what wouldn't work, which meant he could start figuring out what would. By late summer of 1842, Jacob had acquired a small damaged birchbark canoe from a trader passing through the territory. He spent 3 weeks examining every aspect of its construction, taking measurements, testing materials, understanding how the pieces fit together. He studied the way bark was sewn with split spruce roots, how ribs were spaced and shaped, how pitch sealed the seams. He documented everything in his journal with sketches and notes. Then he began his first attempt at building a canoe himself. He selected paper birch trees carefully, looking for specimens with thick bark free from major blemishes. He harvested the bark in the traditional way, cutting carefully to remove large sheets without damaging the living tree beneath. He gathered spruce roots for lashing, split them into thin, flexible strands, and soaked them until they became pliable. He carved ribs from cedar, steaming them over his fire until they could be bent into the curves he needed. The work took 3 weeks of focused effort, and by the end of September, he had completed his first canoe. It was beautiful in its way, light and graceful, the bark pale and smooth. He tested it on calm water first, paddling the Clearwater River near his cabin, and it performed exactly as a traditional canoe should. Fast, responsive, easy to maneuver. Then he began testing it on progressively rougher water. Small rapids first, then larger ones, each test revealing weaknesses he documented carefully in his journal. After 2 weeks of testing, he took the canoe through a set of moderate rapids on a tributary of the Clearwater, nothing even remotely comparable to Snake's Throat, but rough enough to simulate some of the forces the canoe would face. The canoe survived, but barely. By the time he reached calm water below the rapids, he had identified 3 seams that were leaking, 2 ribs that showed stress fractures, and general flexing of the hull that suggested the entire structure was too weak for serious whitewater. Jacob beached the canoe and spent an hour examining every failure point, measuring them, sketching them in his journal. He understood now what Twisted Root had meant. Traditional construction assumed you would use the canoe gently and repair it frequently. Jacob needed something that wouldn't fail when failure meant death. He needed to rebuild everything from the materials up. Winter was coming, which meant he had months to figure out how. Winter descended on the Clearwater Valley in early November, bringing snow that buried the landscape under 3 feet of white silence. Jacob spent those months in near total isolation, working by firelight in his cabin while storms raged outside. He had stockpiled enough dried meat and supplies to last until spring, which meant he could dedicate every waking hour to solving the problems his first canoe had revealed. His leather journal filled with sketches, measurements, and notes as he systematically addressed each weakness he had documented. The pitch formula became his first obsession. Traditional pine pitch worked adequately in warm weather, but became brittle when cold, cracking under stress and allowing water to seep through seams. Jacob began experimenting with different mixtures, adding beeswax, animal fat, and powdered charcoal in varying proportions. He would mix a small batch, apply it to test pieces of bark, then subject those pieces to freezing temperatures overnight before testing their flexibility the next morning. Most mixtures failed, becoming either too brittle or too soft. After 7 weeks of experimentation, he discovered that a mixture of 3 parts pine pitch to 1 part beeswax, with a small amount of bear fat for workability, remained flexible even at temperatures well below freezing. He documented the exact proportions in his journal and moved on to the next problem. Rib spacing proved equally critical. Traditional canoes had ribs spaced approximately 6 inches apart, which provided adequate support for calm water use but allowed too much hull flex under impact. Jacob built test sections with ribs at different spacings, from 3 inches to 8 inches apart, then subjected each section to measured impacts using a hammer and wooden block. He discovered that ribs spaced 3 inches apart provided dramatically better impact resistance while adding only modest weight. The closer spacing distributed force across more structural members simultaneously, preventing any single rib from bearing the full stress of an impact. In January, Twisted Root visited the cabin during a break in the weather. The old man examined Jacob's test sections and journal notes with interest, then shared information about cedar selection and steaming techniques that Jacob hadn't known. Twisted Root explained how certain cedar trees growing in specific conditions produced wood with tighter grain and greater flexibility, making them ideal for ribs that had to bend without breaking. He demonstrated a steaming method using heated rocks in a water-filled hollow log that produced more consistent results than Jacob's fire-based approach. The visit lasted 3 days, and when Twisted Root left, Jacob had filled another 20 pages in his journal with new information. February brought the coldest temperatures of the winter, and Jacob used the time to develop his most significant innovation. He realized that the areas of highest stress on a canoe, specifically the bow and stern where the hull curved most sharply, could be reinforced with a double-layer bark construction. By overlaying 2 sheets of bark with their grain running perpendicular to each other, he created a material significantly stronger than single-layer bark without adding excessive weight. He built test sections and subjected them to impacts that would have punctured single-layer bark. The double-layer sections held. Spring arrived in late March, melting the snow and filling the rivers with runoff. Jacob emerged from his winter isolation with a complete plan documented in his journal and a determination to build a canoe that incorporated every improvement he had developed. He named the project before he even began construction, painting the words "Second Chance" in charcoal on a piece of bark he hung inside his cabin. It was a promise to himself and to Daniel's memory that this time would be different. He began with bark selection, spending 2 full weeks scouting the surrounding forest for perfect paper birch trees. He wasn't looking for just any birch, but for mature specimens with thick bark, minimal scarring, and the particular cream color that indicated healthy growth. He found 6 trees that met his standards and harvested bark from each in early April when the sap was running strong and the bark peeled cleanly. Each sheet was at least 6 feet long and 4 feet wide, far larger than traditional canoe builders would typically use, but Jacob wanted minimal seams in his finished hull. The rib work consumed another 2 weeks. He selected cedar from trees Twisted Root had helped him identify, splitting the wood carefully along the grain to create 50 thin strips, each one precisely measured. He steamed each rib individually using the heated rock method Twisted Root had taught him, bending them over forms he had carved from pine logs, then allowing them to dry completely while held in their curved shapes. The result was a collection of ribs that were uniform in dimension and curve, ready to provide structural support, spaced exactly 3 inches apart. Construction of the hull began in early May. Jacob worked methodically, starting with a temporary frame that would hold the shape while he built around it. He laid the bark sheets with their white inner layer facing outward, overlapping them in a careful shingle pattern that would shed water naturally. For the bow and stern sections, he used his double-layer technique, creating reinforced zones where stress would be highest. The gunwales were ash instead of the softer cedar most builders used, creating a rigid frame that would resist twisting under load. Each seam received double the normal amount of spruce root lashing. The split roots threaded through holes punched with an awl, pulled tight, and tied off with knots that wouldn't slip. The pitch application took 3 days. Jacob heated his improved formula in a small iron pot, applying it in thin layers with a wooden paddle, allowing each layer to cure before adding the next. He applied 3 complete coats to every seam, every lashing point, every potential leak location. The final canoe was heavier than traditional designs, weighing 60 pounds instead of the typical 45, but the additional weight represented strength Jacob knew he would need. When he finally stepped back to examine the completed craft, he felt something close to confidence. It looked right, solid, purposeful. Now he had to find out if it would actually work. Jacob spent the last week of May testing, second chance on progressively more difficult water. He approached the process methodically, treating each test as an experiment that would either validate his improvements or reveal new weaknesses that needed addressing. His first test was on a calm section of the Clearwater River near his cabin, simply paddling back and forth for several hours to assess basic handling characteristics. The canoe felt solid and responsive despite its extra weight, tracking straight when he wanted speed and turning sharply when he needed maneuverability. No leaks appeared after 3 hours on the water. The second test came 2 days later on Class 2 rapids a mile downstream from his cabin. These were gentle by mountain standards, more fast-moving current than genuine whitewater, but they provided enough turbulence to test the pitch seals and hull flex. Jacob ran the rapids 3 times, deliberately taking different lines through the water to vary the stresses on the canoe. After the third run, he beached the craft and examined every seam carefully. He found one minor leak where a seam had been inadequately sealed, repaired it with heated pitch, and ran the rapids twice more. The repair held perfectly. By early June, Jacob felt ready for more serious testing. He traveled 15 miles upriver to a section of Class 3 rapids known locally as Devil's Staircase, a half-mile stretch of water that dropped 50 feet through a series of ledges and standing waves. He had run these rapids before in a bullboat and knew their characteristics well. The entrance was straightforward, but the middle section featured a reversal wave that could flip unwary boaters, and the exit required precise navigation between 2 large boulders. He studied the water for 30 minutes before committing, then pushed off into the current. The canoe performed beautifully through the entrance and middle sections, the reinforced bow-deflecting water that would have swamped a traditional craft. But at the boulder section, Jacob misjudged his angle by a few degrees. The canoe struck the left boulder with enough force to send a shudder through the entire hull and knock Jacob momentarily off balance. He recovered his paddle position and completed the run, but his heart was racing as he reached calm water below. He beached immediately and examined the impact point, expecting to find catastrophic damage. What he found instead was a single cracked rib and some stress marks on the bark, but no puncture, no separated seams, no structural failure. A traditional canoe would have split completely open from that impact. Jacob made field repairs using materials he had brought specifically for this purpose: a spare piece of bark, heated pitch from a small pot he carried, and rawhide binding to reinforce the cracked rib. The repairs took 2 hours and held perfectly when he tested them. But the incident taught him something crucial. The canoe could survive impacts that would destroy traditional craft, but it had limits. He needed one more modification before attempting Snake's Throat, a reinforcement he should have included from the beginning. Jacob spent the next week back at his cabin, adding his final modification to Second Chance. He created a keel spine from thin strips of ash wood, laminating 5 layers together with pitch and rawhide binding to form a flexible but incredibly strong reinforcement that ran the entire length of the canoe's bottom. The spine added 5 pounds to the overall weight, but distributed impact stress across the entire hull rather than concentrating it at a single point. When he finished, he tested the modification on Devil's Staircase again, deliberately striking rocks he had avoided on his first run. The canoe absorbed impacts that would have destroyed it before. Word had spread through the trapping community about Jacob's project and his stated intention to run Snake's Throat. By mid-June, trappers began arriving at his cabin to see the canoe and attempt to talk him out of his plan. Marcus Shaw arrived first, a grizzled mountain man in his 50s who had lost his brother to Snake's Throat 10 years earlier. Marcus examined the canoe carefully, running his hands along the seams and ribs, testing the strength of the gunwales, checking the pitch seals. He acknowledged the quality of the craftsmanship, but explained in brutal detail exactly how the rapids would kill Jacob anyway. The entrance rapid dropped 8 feet in 50 yards, compressing the river into a narrow chute where the water formed standing waves tall enough to flip any boat. Below that came a rock garden, where submerged boulders created unpredictable currents that could spin a craft sideways and smash it against stone walls. Marcus had watched his brother's bullboat disintegrate in the rock garden, the hide tearing like paper, his brother disappearing into the churning water. Other trappers came with similar stories, each more harrowing than the last. A young man named Cooper described watching his partner get sucked into a reversal wave that held him underwater for nearly a minute before releasing his drowned body downstream. An older trapper named Williams showed Jacob scars from his own near-death experience on a different river, explaining how the cold water had sapped his strength so quickly he barely made it to shore. Each visitor left convinced that Jacob was going to die, and each departure only strengthened Jacob's resolve. Twisted Root arrived in late June and spent an entire day examining Second Chance without speaking. He tested every seam, checked every rib, studied the double-layer bow construction and the laminated keel spine. Finally, he sat down beside Jacob at the fire and delivered his assessment. The craftsmanship was excellent, perhaps the finest birchbark work he had ever seen. But Snake's Throat had killed men in better boats with more experience. When Jacob showed him the journal documenting every design decision and every test, Twisted Root acknowledged the thoroughness but warned that knowledge couldn't guarantee survival. Jacob explained his reasoning about portage deaths versus river deaths, about finding a better way forward instead of accepting that certain obstacles were simply impossible. Twisted Root listened, then asked when Jacob planned to make the attempt. 3 days from now, Jacob said, at dawn. Dawn broke clear and cold on the morning Jacob had chosen for his attempt. He stood at the riverbank 2 miles above Snake's Throat, with Second Chance resting in the shallows beside him, and he was not alone. Word had spread, and nearly 20 people had gathered to witness what would happen. There were trappers who had come to watch him succeed or fail, traders passing through the territory who had delayed their journeys to see the attempt, and several Nez Perce, including Twisted Root, who stood silently near the tree line. No one spoke much. The distant roar of the rapids filled the air with a sound like continuous thunder, a reminder of what waited downstream. Jacob loaded his gear with deliberate care. A coil of rope in case he needed to secure the canoe or pull himself to shore. His hunting knife strapped to his belt. A spare paddle lashed inside the hull. The small pot of pitch and repair materials wrapped in oiled cloth. Everything was tied down, so nothing could be lost if the canoe flipped. He wore his heaviest buckskin clothing despite the morning warmth, knowing the river water would be brutally cold from mountain snowmelt. He checked every seam one final time, running his fingers along the pitch seals, confirming that everything was as ready as human effort could make it. Then he pushed the canoe into deeper water and climbed in, settling into the position he had practiced hundreds of times. The current caught him immediately, pulling him away from shore and toward the sound of the rapids. There was no turning back now, no changing his mind, no safe exit. The river chose his path and his speed. Jacob focused on his paddle work, keeping the canoe aligned with the current, making small corrections to avoid obstacles he could see from upstream. The sound of Snake's Throat grew louder with each passing minute, changing from distant thunder to immediate roar. He rounded a bend and saw the entrance rapid ahead, the river dropping away into churning white chaos. The canoe hit the drop and plunged into the maelstrom. Water exploded over the reinforced bow, drenching Jacob instantly, but the canoe held its line and drove through the standing wave instead of being thrown sideways. The chute compressed around him, walls of water rising on both sides, the current accelerating to speeds that made steering almost impossible. Jacob fought to keep the bow straight, using every technique he had developed, his paddle biting into water that felt more like stone than liquid. A submerged rock appeared directly ahead, with no time to avoid it. The canoe struck hard, the impact reverberating through the hull and up through Jacob's arms. The laminated keel spine did exactly what he had designed it to do, distributing the shock along the entire length of the canoe instead of concentrating it at a single failure point. The hull flexed but held together. Then a cross-current caught the stern and spun the canoe sideways. Jacob felt control slip away as the river took over, spinning him toward the rock garden where most boats were destroyed. Jacob fought the spin with desperate paddle strokes, leaning his weight to counteract the rotation, using every ounce of strength and skill he possessed. The canoe responded sluggishly in the violent current, but it responded. He brought the bow back around just as he entered the rock garden, threading between two massive boulders with inches to spare on either side. More rocks appeared ahead, some visible above the surface, others lurking just beneath the churning water. He navigated by instinct and reflexes, honed through months of testing, reading the water's surface for signs of what lay below. The canoe struck 2 more rocks in quick succession, each impact sending shudders through the hull, but the reinforced construction held. Then he was through the rock garden and approaching the final rapid, a narrow gap between stone walls where the entire river compressed into a channel barely 20 feet wide. Jacob aimed for the center of the gap and committed everything to one final burst of paddle work. The current accelerated to terrifying speed, the water pressing against the canoe with force that felt intentional, malicious. The walls blurred past. Then suddenly he was through, shooting out into calmer water below the rapids, the roar of Snake's throat fading behind him. Jacob's arms shook with exhaustion as he paddled toward shore, barely able to believe he was alive and the canoe was still intact beneath him. He beached Second Chance on a gravel bar and sat in the hull for several minutes, too drained to move, listening to his own heartbeat slowly return to normal. When he finally climbed out to examine the canoe, he found damage but nothing catastrophic. 2 ribs showed stress cracks. 1 seam had developed a minor leak. The bark showed impact marks and abrasions along the keel line. But the canoe had survived 3 miles of water that had killed 17 men, and Jacob had completed the run in less than 20 minutes. Word spread through the trapping community within days. Men who had heard about the attempt but hadn't witnessed it traveled to see Second Chance and hear Jacob describe every moment of the run. He shared his techniques freely, showing trappers his journal with its detailed construction notes, explaining the bark selection, the rib spacing, the pitch formula, the double-layer reinforcement, the laminated keel spine. Not everyone who saw the canoe tried to replicate it. The construction required more time, skill, and patience than most trappers could invest, but some did, and those who built Kellerman-style canoes found success on rivers previously considered impossible. By 1845, at least 7 trappers were running dangerous rapids instead of portaging around them. The 3-week detour around Snake's Throat gradually fell out of use as more people chose the river over the trail. Jacob continued trapping for 5 more years, but he became known less for his pelts than for the canoe design that had changed how men moved through the mountains. In 1848, he built his final canoe and gave it to a young trapper heading into the Rockies, along with his journal filled with everything he had learned.